The day my husband said another woman's pregnancy was my fault. I was standing in the kitchen with olive oil still on my hands and the smell of raw garlic clinging to my fingers, watching the roast chicken through the fogged oven glass while, outside in the backyard, the neighbor's sprinkler turned in steady circles over the cold grass of early October. The words came out of him strangely softly, almost wearily, as if he were reminding me I had forgotten to buy milk or missed a dentist appointment for our daughter. "If you had been there for me," Mark said, slowly loosening his tie from around his neck, "none of this would have happened." I remember exactly the sound the oven clock made when it changed from 12 to 13 in that moment. I remember the white ceramic salad plate slipping from my hand and striking the edge of the sink without breaking. I remember the rosemary from the tray of roasted potatoes suddenly turning sickening, like the smell of something burning from inside the wall. And I remember the most humiliating part of all. For 1 second, one very short, very cold second, I believed him. My name is Laura Bennett. I was 43 years old, the mother of 2 children, a near full-time homemaker for 15 years, because we used to call it the best decision for our family. I had once earned a master's degree in education, once stood in front of middle school classrooms with a strong voice and a straight back, once thought I would become an assistant principal before I turned 40. Then I got married, had Noah, then Emma, and 1 year off turned into 2, then 5, then an entirely different life, one where I knew my children's vaccine schedules better than their social security numbers, knew which month the fridge filter needed replacing, knew what hour the sun hit the kitchen window so the basil on the sill would, and scorch, knew exactly where each child sat at the table when they were sad, and knew from the way my husband stepped onto the front porch what kind of day he'd had. I used to think that was another kind of intelligence, not glamorous, but valuable. Later, I came to understand that there are men who love turning a woman's sacrifice into an invisible support system. And then, when they want to betray her, they use that very invisibility as proof that she has lost herself and made the marriage suffocate. We lived in a suburb north of Chicago, where fall arrived with the sound of dry maple leaves skittering across driveways, the smell of pumpkin and cinnamon in the grocery stores, and wreaths hanging on front doors that almost every woman on the block seemed to buy from the same place at the end of September. Our house wasn't remarkable, but it was beautiful in exactly the way that makes people looking in from the outside think stable. 2 stories, painted pale beige, blue-gray shutters, a small porch with 2 pots of yellow mums in the fall, an oak table in the middle of the kitchen, family photos lining the staircase, magnets from School O, and the refrigerator, grocery lists, and drawings from when Emma was still in elementary school. My husband, Mark Bennett, was 46 and worked as a regional operations director for an industrial supply chain company. On the outside, he was the kind of man who made every mother at the school fundraiser nod approvingly. Tall, neat haircut, calm voice, the kind of guy who'd carry folding chairs after an event, remember the principal's name, wear crisp white shirts, and occasionally show up at the kids' games with a box of Dunkin' for the whole team. Mark wasn't the loud kind of charming. He was appealing because he was measured, the kind of man who could look at a woman panicking over burnt cookies at a bake sale and say, "It's okay, I'll handle the rest," and immediately make her feel grateful. When I met him at 26 at a college friend's birthday party in Evanston, what drew me to him wasn't lightning or wild excitement. It was safety. I had just come out of a relationship with a man who was too free in all the wrong ways, hot and cold, full of grand words, always late, always forgetting his promises. Mark was the opposite. He arrived early, drove a Honda Accord so clean, there wasn't even an old receipt on the passenger seat, knocked on my door instead of texting I'm outside, brought soup when I had a cold, called my mother on her birthday after hearing me mention it exactly once. I used to think, finally, I've fallen in love with a grown man. I didn't know counterfeit maturity is the most durable mask of all. Our marriage was built out of small things. I used to think marriages shattered because of enormous disasters, until I found myself living inside one that had been destroyed by small things repeated with perfect rhythm. Mark remembered I liked my toast slightly burnt and my butter spread thin. He changed the water tank in the humidifier every winter. Every Saturday morning, when the kids were little, he made pancakes so I could sleep an extra half hour. Every Thanksgiving, he drove all the way up to Milwaukee to bring my mother down for a few days because she hated long drives. When Noah left for college, Mark stood in the middle of the dorm room with a folding chair in his hand, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, and still turned to me and smiled and said, "We did good, huh?" I looked at him in that moment and saw a man who had walked with me through almost 2 decades of life. 2 moves, 1 miscarriage. Between Noah and Emma that I once thought would kill me, 3 minor surgeries for my mother, hundreds of parent-teacher meetings, the COVID years with 2 kids doing school online in the house, the months we struggled after his company cut bonuses, the nights we sat at the kitchen counter after the children were asleep, yellow light spilling over mugs of tea while the dishwasher hummed in the background, talking about money, the house, the future, when I should go back to work, whether we should buy a weekend cabin the way my mother-in-law always suggests. Our life was not perfect, but it had structure, habits, the feeling of being anchored very firmly in ordinary things. And that was what made every crack afterward hurt almost like an insult. I did not walk into a marriage that was already rotten and lie to myself about it. I stepped into a house that seemed to have a real foundation. It was only that the man who had laid that foundation beside me had been secretly hollowing it out for much longer than I knew. Jessica Monroe entered our story almost invisibly. At first, if you had said her name out loud, I probably couldn't even have pictured her clearly. I heard about Jessica in ordinary little scraps. The new girl on project coordination. Jessica made the presentation deck look great. Poor kid, she just moved here from Minneapolis, doesn't know anyone yet. Mark talked about her the same way he talked about other coworkers, with a neutral tone and just enough detail to prove there was nothing remarkable about her. Jessica was 28, dark blonde hair, worked fast, usually wore cream blazers and white sneakers in that modern industrial office downtown. First time I met her was at Mark's company holiday party, in a hotel ballroom in Oak Brook, under warm golden lights, with the sound of clinking glasses and the smell of smoked salmon and cheap champagne. Jessica was standing by the bar, laughing at something. Mark pointed toward her and said, "That's Jessica. She saved my life on the Cleveland account last month." When she turned around, I remember thinking she looked younger than her age, almost fragile, but her eyes weren't innocent at all. Some women look at you as if they're simply noticing you. Jessica looked at me as though she calculated something very quickly, and then hid it. But the moment was too brief. She shook my hand and said, "Laura, I've heard so much about you," in that sweet voice young women often use with their boss's wife when they want to seem harmless. I smiled, thanked her, asked whether she'd settled into the area yet. She said she was still trying to find a grocery store with good sourdough. I even told her the bakery I liked. Months later, when I was reading their old messages, I found the one she had sent Mark that exact night at 8 p.m. "Your wife is prettier than I expected." That almost makes this worse. Mark replied, "She trusts too easily." In the early days, I thought the thing that hurt most was the baby in her belly. No, the thing that hurt most was that line, "She trusts too easily," because that was the moment I understood he hadn't just betrayed a wife. He had studied a person, and then named her weakness in a voice as calm as if he were labeling an Excel file. The first crack didn't come like a great shock. It came in tone. Mark started getting more irritable, but not in the explosive way that makes people easy to identify. He got irritable in a way that made you wonder whether maybe you really were becoming annoying. I would tell him something small about my mother forgetting her blood pressure medication, and he wouldn't even look up from his laptop before saying, "Can this wait? I'm in the middle of something." I asked whether I could drive to Milwaukee with my mother that weekend, and he sighed and said, "Laura, everything doesn't have to become an emergency." One time, I simply reminded him to call Noah because our son was stressed about registering for classes, and Mark yanked open the kitchen drawer and turned to me with such cold, level eyes that I stopped in the middle of the sentence. "You don't have to micromanage everyone in this house." Afterward, he always corrected himself. That was the part that made a person come apart slowly. After every sharp remark, there was always some compensating gesture. A hand on my shoulder, a more generous pour of wine than usual, a sigh. "I'm sorry, work is insane." A tired smile. A sentence that made me feel smaller for having taken it personally. "You're just so sensitive lately. You take everything personally. You always hear accusation where there isn't any." At first I argued. Then I explained. Then eventually I began to fall silent, because that is how the most powerful gaslighting works. Not by telling you you're crazy right away, but by making you doubt the precision of your own feelings, little by little, until you start biting your tongue every time you're about to speak. Mark was especially good at that. He didn't erase reality altogether. He shifted it half an inch at a time, just enough so that when I collided with it, I blamed myself for being clumsy. Change in me came before I fully admitted the change in him. I started revising what I meant to say before I said it. Started asking myself before every reaction whether I was being too much. I would look at myself in the bathroom mirror while brushing my hair and hear Mark's voice repeating in my head, "You've changed." He had started saying that in late winter. At first it sounded like a sad observation. Then it became a soft accusation. "You're not warm anymore. You're always tired. You never really look at me when I talk." Once, when I reminded him that I had stayed up until almost 1 in the morning helping Emma with an AP history assignment and still had to take my mother to a doctor's appointment the next morning, Mark looked at me and shrugged. Everyone's tired, Laura, but not everyone makes it their whole personality. I don't know whether what hurt more then was the sentence itself, or the part of me that immediately went looking for proof that he might be right. I had stopped teaching 15 years earlier. I no longer had an independent, stable income. My personal retirement savings had slowed down in direct proportion to the years. I stayed home to become the logistics backbone of this family. There were nights I lay next to him, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant cars on the cul-de-sac, and thought with terrible sincerity that maybe I really had become dull. Maybe women who lose touch with their careers for too long really do fade. Maybe Mark was turning cold because I had lost the very thing that once made me interesting. That was the beginning of the psychological collapse. You are not made to believe right away that you deserve betrayal. You are only led, step by step, into asking whether you have become harder to love. The first message I saw wasn't enough to save me from denial. I was folding towels in the laundry room when Mark's phone lit up on the wooden shelf beside the dryer. He was mowing the lawn out back, country music playing softly through a portable speaker. The screen stayed lit only a few seconds, but I saw Jessica's name and the preview line, "Thank you for last night." I stood still. One of the towels slipped to my feet, and I didn't pick it up. When Mark came in 10 minutes later, his t-shirt dark with sweat around the collar, I asked as casually as I could, or at least as casually as I thought I had, "What is Jessica thanking you for?" He didn't flinch. That was the frightening part. He just opened the fridge, took out some water, took a drink, and looked at me as if I had asked about the weather. "What? The message?" I tried to keep my voice light. "What was she thanking you for last night?" Mark pressed his lips together in that patient, enduring way of his. We were finalizing the scent. Louis Deck. She stayed late. I dropped revised files off at her place because she forgot her laptop charger at the office. I looked at him. At her place? It was on my way. "Since when does your staff text you thank you for last night like that?" He set the bottle down harder than necessary. "Jesus, Laura, do you hear yourself?" I went quiet, and that was when he took that next textbook step. The one Dana, my therapist later, would call planting the seed of suspicion inside the person asking the question. "You don't trust me anymore?" he said, not loudly, but with so much disappointment. "That's what this is." I didn't say that. "No, you just wait until you have one half-seen text and then build a whole little trial in your head." I could feel my face flushing with embarrassment, shame, because suddenly even I could hear my own question as bitter. "I was just asking." "No," he said. "You were accusing." Then he pulled me against him, kissed the top of my head like a husband worn thin but still kind to his anxious wife. "I need you on my side, Laura, not making work harder than it already is." That night I apologized. I apologized for reading too much into a vague message. Every time I think back to that moment now, I don't just feel angry at him. I feel a devastating sadness for the woman who had been trained to apologize for her own intuition. Then came the night he didn't come home. There was a major storm, the kind of hard rain and battering wind that makes the back fence shudder in waves. Thunder pounding the window panes as if someone were throwing rocks at the house. Mark texted at 8:12 p.m. "Stuck downtown. Roads are terrible. Might just stay at the hotel by the office." I stared at that message for a very long time. Not because it wasn't plausible, but because it was too plausible, too perfectly constructed to argue with. Emma was upstairs studying. Noah called from his dorm to ask whether I needed him home that weekend. I stood alone in the kitchen with my phone in my hand, rain hammering the awning outside. And for the first time in many months, I could feel the split inside me clearly. One part of me wanted to say, "Don't worry, stay there. The roads are dangerous." The other part was cold as ice. The next morning, Mark came home in the same white dress shirt from the day before, the collar slightly wrinkled, smelling of hotel soap and black coffee. He kissed my cheek and asked whether Emma had left for school yet, just like any other morning. I looked at the hand he used to set his keys in the wooden bowl by the door and heard myself ask, "Where did you sleep?" "The Westin near the office." "Alone?" The word slipped out before I could stop. Mark turned all the way toward me. Not angry, more dangerous than angry. "Still, are you serious? I'm just asking." "No, you're not. You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "That thing where you decide there's a hidden crime in every ordinary detail." I still remember how my face burned, though I had done nothing shameful except ask my husband where he had slept. But he kept going, each sentence driving deeper into the softest part of me. "You've been off for months. You don't sleep. You spiral. You make connections that aren't there and then stare at me like I'm supposed to defend myself against your imagination." I stood there in an old sweater, still holding an untouched cup of coffee, and it is horrible to admit that some part of me shrank back because I was a frat. He might be right. Not completely, but I was tired enough to want the explanation that hurt less. That I was making too much of things. That is how people get broken. Not in one blow, by exhaustion. I found out Jessica was pregnant on a Thursday afternoon at the end of October. And the truth didn't come to me like an explosion so much as a blade driven into a place already cracked. I was in Target buying tissues, AA batteries, and the brand of granola Emma liked when I saw Jessica at the far end of the baby aisle. It took me a few seconds to recognize her at first, because outside the office she looked softer, younger, less armored. She was wearing a loose beige sweater, black leggings, one hand resting instinctively on her stomach the way pregnant women often do, the other holding a box of baby bottles. I stood frozen between shelves of wipes and diapers, and she turned her head, saw me, and in the exact instant our eyes met, the color drained from her face. Not the embarrassed look of a girl caught in an awkward situation. The startled look of someone who understood immediately that something long kept in two separate worlds had just collided. I didn't walk up to her right away. I stood still, looking at her belly, at the way her hand tightened around the cart. And then finally she was the one who came toward me. "Laura," she said, voice low and dry. "Hi," I looked straight at her stomach. "How far along are you?" She stiffened. "I don't. How many weeks?" Her mouth trembled very slightly. 20 weeks. 5 months. I calculated fast. With the cold arithmetic every betrayed woman eventually learns if she wants to survive. 5 months meant too many Tuesdays, too many hotel receipts, too many lies layered over each other to ever call this a mistake. I lifted my eyes to hers. "Is it his?" Jessica didn't answer, and that silence was answer enough. I didn't scream, didn't hit her, didn't throw anything. I only looked at her for one long second more and then turned away. Because if I had stayed any longer, I wasn't sure my body would remember how to function. That night I confronted Mark in the kitchen, the same place where the sentence that would become a permanent scar inside my mind was spoken. He had just gotten home, jacket still damp with cold mist, his phone still face down in the outer pocket. I didn't circle the subject. "Jessica is pregnant," Mark faltered slightly. Only someone who has lived with another person for a very long time could have seen a hesitation that small. Then he took off his watch. "Okay, is it yours?" The question sounded like a shard of glass dragged over brick as it left my mouth. He looked up at me, no apology, no immediate denial, no shock, just a silence that made the entire kitchen seem smaller. "It might be," he said at last. "I think if someone wanted to kill a marriage as efficiently as possible, they would do it with those two words. Not yes, which at least contains truth. Not no, which at least leaves room for argument. But that floating maybe, that makes the other person fall with nothing to grab onto." "Might be," I repeated, almost laughing from the choke in my throat. "Might be." And then he said the first sentence in the chain of sentences that would destroy my sense of reality more deeply than any sexual betrayal ever could. "You pushed me away." I stared at him, truly stared. "What? You pushed me away, Laura? Years ago? Don't. No, listen to me." His voice dropped steady, almost rational. "That was what made it horrific. You checked out of this marriage long before anything happened with Jessica. Mark, you stopped touching me. You stopped seeing me. Everything in this house became chores and kids and schedules, and your mother and your anxiety, and what Emma forgot and what Noah needed, and when the gutters had to be cleaned." I stepped back as if I had been slapped. "So you got your coworker pregnant?" "I'm not saying it was right." "That's exactly what you're saying. I'm saying this didn't happen in a vacuum." Then he stepped one step closer, driving language straight into the center of my chest. "If you had been there for me, none of this would have happened." And that was when, if only for a second, I believed him. Because the strongest gaslighting doesn't say something completely absurd. It takes the very place you have already been doubting yourself and drives the knife in deeper. I apologized to him the next night. I write that now and still feel a cold, bone-deep shame. But I will not lie in memory to make myself look wiser than I was. I apologized, not fully, not in the sense of forgiveness or taking all the blame, just in a broken, choking fragment in our bedroom, while I stood by the window staring out at the dark cul-de-sac, clutching the edge of my cardigan and said, "If I made you feel alone." "I'm sorry." Mark stood behind me with his hands in his pockets. He didn't touch me right away. He let me step into the region of guilt on my own first, just as practiced manipulators always know to do. Then he came closer, placed his hand on my shoulder very gently, and sighed like a man carrying a tragedy that belonged to both of us. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. "I just didn't know how to talk to you anymore." I turned to look at him, my eyes swollen, my head aching, my heart feeling like something that had been left soaking in acid too long. "Are you leaving?" I asked. He paused. "I don't know. Do you love her? That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He looked at me for a very long time and said the sentence that kept me awake for months afterward. "The point is that I haven't felt wanted in this house in a very long time." That sentence was a trap lined with my own insecurity, because who doesn't sometimes fear they are no longer desirable after years of marriage, after children, after 10,000 dinners, after endless mornings of waking up with under-eye circles and a to-do list. He knew exactly where to place the bomb, so I would light the fuse myself. The months that followed were the most suffocating part of my life, not because I didn't know the truth, but because I lived in the middle of the truth and let it rewrite my brain day by day. Mark didn't leave the house right away. He didn't cut things off with Jessica either. Everything hung in a toxic suspension. I knew she was pregnant. I knew he was still seeing her. But at home, he began retelling our marriage as if I had been the force that had rotted it from the inside for years. "You haven't really been happy for a long time. You used to laugh. You reject everything before I even finish asking. That trip to Asheville. You were miserable the whole time. Some of it was false. Some of it was partly true. And that was what made me slide." He denied my memory not by erasing it, but by warping it from within. One time I mentioned the night I stayed at the hospital with my mother for 10 hours and still came home in time to pick up Emma. And Mark looked at me and said, "That's not how it happened. I was the one who rearranged my whole week for your family and you barely noticed." I opened my mouth to protest, then slowed, then asked myself, is that true? Was I too exhausted? Did I remember the sequence wrong? Had I really been ungrateful? That is where the real hell lies, not in one great shock. In the moment, you begin to doubt the structure of your own memory. I slept less and less. My stomach hurt. My heart raced for no reason. I drove to Jewel-Osco and stood in the laundry detergent aisle, unable to remember what I had come there to buy. I started writing down our conversations immediately after they happened, like someone losing their mind, trying to preserve the last boundary between herself and the fog. Mark saw the notebook once, picked it up, flipped through a few pages, and gave me a sad little smile. "You really think I'm the enemy, huh?" I snatched it back as if I were yanking away the last intact part of my own brain. "I think I'm forgetting what's real. Maybe you need help," he said. And that sentence in that context was no longer concern. It was leverage. "You're not sleeping. You cry over nothing. Emma told me you snapped at her yesterday. I'm worried about you." The best gaslighters always know how to wrap an attack in the language of concern. I came apart faster than I ever imagined I could. There were mornings I sat in the car outside Emma's school parking lot after dropping her off and couldn't undo my seatbelt, because the thought of going back to that house, of smelling his aftershave again on a towel, of hearing his voice saying you're overreacting made me feel as if my chest had been pressed against a wall. I started wearing sunglasses even on cloudy days, because I didn't want the neighbors to see how swollen my eyes were. My best friend, Diane, whom I had known since my teaching days, was the first person to say out loud the thing I was too deep in the haze to name myself. She stopped by one day with soup, looked at me for a long time in the kitchen, and asked, "Laura, has he made you believe this is all your fault?" I remember laughing then, a bizarre broken sound. "Isn't some of it?" Diane set the spoon down. "Something is very wrong here." Just 5 words, but I nearly burst into tears, because for the first time someone standing outside the story did not look at me as if I were a wife losing control. Diane didn't ask whether I was sure Mark was cheating, didn't ask whether I had snooped through his phone, didn't ask whether I could forgive him. She just looked at my kitchen, at the tulips dying slowly in the vase, at the way I jumped every time the garage door rattled, and said, "You don't look like a woman who's angry. You look like a woman who's being rewritten from the inside." That sentence saved me more than she ever knew. Emma started seeing things too, the things I still hadn't said. She was 16, old enough not to believe only in the version of reality adults perform for children. One evening when Mark went out for air, after another heavy dinner, Emma stood in the kitchen doorway with a glass of water in her hand, watching her father's car back down the driveway, then asked quietly, "Why does Dad always start fights before he leaves?" I turned toward her. "What do you think?" Emma shrugged, but her eyes were red. "Because then he gets to act like he had a reason." That sentence sent a chill from the nape of my neck all the way down my spine. I don't know where she learned that kind of precision. Maybe children raised inside a distorted atmosphere grow their own kind of radar. Noah from college was beginning to feel it too. In the family group chat, he wrote less and less to his father. One weekend home, he watched Mark sit at dinner with that cold face while I kept correcting myself in the middle of my own sentences, and later texted me privately from his old room upstairs. Is he being cruel to you, or am I imagining it? I sat on the edge of my bed reading that message with shaking hands. Because if even my children were beginning to see it, then the lid on the pot was no longer holding. The twist I had never anticipated, until I began looking more closely, was that Jessica was not simply a victim. In the first months after discovering her pregnancy, the part of me trained to stay soft toward younger women, had thought maybe she had been led by Mark, exploited by her boss, swept up by power and promises. But the truth began cracking in a different direction, once I started checking everything again with a mind a little less clouded. One evening, Mark forgot his company iPad at home. I didn't open it because I wanted his privacy. I opened it because I had stopped believing in the thing called privacy inside this marriage. In the calendar, there were meetings Jessica had sent with meaningless titles like vendor sync, but the locations were hotels instead of the office. In old email threads, I found a short reply from nearly 2 years earlier, back when she had first joined the company, after Mark had turned down a drink after work. No worries. I'm patient. I sat staring at the screen and felt the disgust changing shape. This was not just a young woman being lured in. This was two people looking at each other, measuring mutual appetite and advantage, and then stepping forward anyway. There was evidence she knew very well he had a family. On my old Instagram, before I deleted family photos a few years earlier because I wanted to live more privately, Jessica had liked pictures of Emma at prom, Noah's move-in day at college, our 20th anniversary post. She knew, and still stepped in, still did it. That discovery did not make the pain any smaller. It only killed the last innocent part of me one more time. The moment I really woke up was not loud. It didn't come when I saw the biggest piece of evidence, and it didn't come with the cruelest sentence. It came on a January morning, with dirty snow still clinging to the curb, while I sat in the car outside the parking lot of my new therapist's office, hands on the cold steering wheel, rereading the chat between Mark and Jessica from the night I apologized to him. I had taken screenshots of everything before, but I hadn't been clear enough yet to truly see the pattern. That night, while I stood by the bedroom window crying and apologizing for making him feel alone, Mark had gone into the bathroom and texted Jessica. She's finally starting to get it. Need her calm until after the quarter closes. I read that and something in my mind stopped moving. No more fog, no more debate, no more maybe I was partly wrong. Just one sharp truth, so cold it was almost transparent. He had not only betrayed me, he had deliberately made me doubt myself in order to keep control. The whole chain of denial, attack, reversal, soft reassurance. Then denial again had not been the spontaneous reaction of a confused man. It was a pattern: deny, attack, reverse blame, make me doubt myself, make me apologize, keep me soft enough for him to manage the money, the reputation, the job, and the child growing inside his mistress. I sat in the car, watching my own breath cloud the glass, and felt something ancient and primitive in my chest wake up. Not hope, not love, the last instinct for self-preservation. I no longer wanted to understand him. I no longer wanted to be believed or comforted. I only wanted the truth dragged fully into the light before he could rename it something else. That was when I stopped reacting and started watching. I talked less. I stopped crying in front of Mark. I stopped arguing. I began to go silent in a way that unsettled him. When he said, "You're being dramatic," I nodded. When he asked, "Are we really doing this tonight?" I said, "Not tonight." I collected everything. Messages, Jessica's obstetric appointments that had been mistakenly routed into a shared company email chain and forwarded internally. The money Mark transferred into a new account, opened in his own name. Hotel invoices, credit card statements, voice memos I recorded for myself after every conversation. I took pictures of the clock every time he came home late, saved babysitter schedules, printed every email she sent him. I even did something I never once imagined myself doing before. I opened the document folder on the home office printer and searched for scanned insurance form. That was where I found Jessica Monroe listed as a secondary emergency contact on a policy Mark had updated just 3 weeks earlier. Not the full beneficiary, not yet, but enough for me to know he had already been thinking ahead. He wasn't just cheating, he was preparing the structure of the life that would come after the cheating. And I, the woman who had spent 15 years in that kitchen wrapping Christmas presents, baking lasagna for soccer teams, attending parent-teacher conferences, caring for both sets of aging parents, was being scheduled out of his life like an expense that needed to be settled cleanly. That was what made me lucid more than therapy ever could. When someone is planning to make you disappear neatly, the only thing left to do is refuse to disappear. I met with a lawyer in February. Her name was Marlene Shaw, in her 50s, silver gray hair cut short, voice as calm as someone who had seen every kind of collapse American marriage could manufacture. I brought the binder with me, thick enough that she had to lift it with both hands. Marlene went through it for nearly an hour, barely interrupting me. Occasionally, she asked exactly one question. Do your children know? Does he control the accounts? Any history of physical violence? Do you still share a bed? I answered, and I told her even the humiliating parts. How I had believed it was my fault, how I had apologized, how I had thought I might be losing my mind. Marlene looked at me for a long time after that and then said, "Good. That means he almost got what he wanted." I think I frowned. Which was not the affair. Control, then she tapped the binder lightly. This is not a man who slipped. This is a man who managed. That was the word that set everything in place. Managed, administered, coordinated, calculated. I was no longer trapped inside the question of why he had done it. That question was too soft for a man like Mark. The right question was, how had he arranged it? And once you start looking at betrayal as a structure of power instead of a burst of sexual impulse, you stop blaming yourself for your desirability, your softness, your femininity. You begin to see the other person as someone building a system around you, and only then can you learn how to break it. I chose Sunday family dinner at the end of March to expose everything. It was not random. Noah would be home from college for spring break. Emma had just finished her school play. Mark's parents were scheduled to visit. My sister and her husband were already planning to stop by after church. The kind of evening that, in families like ours, meant roast, wine, SAT talk, real estate talk, and complaints about grocery prices. Mark thought he still controlled the narrative at least a little. For weeks, he had been floating trial balloons like maybe after the quarter ends. We should tell people we've been struggling. He wanted to strip the present of responsibility by reframing the whole story as a marriage that had been dead for years. He even had the nerve to say to Emma once, right in front of me, "Sometimes adults grow apart even when they both try." I watched my daughter go stiff on the couch and knew I would not give him one more inch. That evening, I cooked exactly what everyone expected. Pot roast, green beans, cornbread, and apple pie cooling on the counter. I wore the dark blue sweater dress Mark used to say made me look like myself again. Not because I wanted to look beautiful for him, but because I did not want to step into the moment of reclaiming my voice, looking like a woman who had been pulverized. I wanted every person in that room to remember me that night as steady. Not shaking, not screaming, not coming apart. Just as I knew he would, Mark started first. After the main course had been served, while everyone still held their wineglasses, and Noah was telling a story about some unhinged professor on campus, Mark set his glass down and laced his fingers together like a man preparing to announce something painful but mature. I had seen that posture too many times at school meetings and boardrooms not to recognize it. "I think," he said, looking down at the table instead of at me, "Laura and I have been going through a very difficult year." My mother-in-law looked up immediately. Emma stopped moving her fork. Noah turned toward me. I let Mark take a few more steps into it, because I wanted him to be the one to walk into the hole he had dug. "Sometimes," he continued, voice soft, sad enough, "people try for a long time and still end up hurting each other." My sister glanced at me. I set my napkin down, wiped my hands very slowly, and said in such a normal voice that the whole table went silent, "No, we're not doing it that way." Mark looked up, and I saw the first moment he realized the night no longer belonged to him. I stood, walked into the office, brought the binder out, and placed it in the center of the dining table right beside the breadbasket. The metal ring snapping open in that too small room sounded like a gun being cocked. "If there has to be truth tonight," I said, looking from face to face around the family, "then it's going to be the real truth." Mark spoke fast, low. "Laura, don't." I turned toward him. "You've said that to me for a year." "Enough." Then I opened the first tab. Messages, hotels, schedules, screenshots, company expense reports. The line he has no idea. The line she's finally starting to get it. The line about the pregnancy. The line about how I had made him lonely. The line where he told Jessica he needed to keep me calm until after the quarter closes. Not everyone looked at every page. They didn't have to. A few pages were enough to change the temperature of the room. My mother-in-law put her hand over her mouth. My father-in-law stood up so fast his chair shoved back hard against the floor. Noah looked from the papers to his father's face, and then to mine, as if his whole body needed a few seconds to accept two versions of the man who had once taught him to throw a baseball. Emma cried first, but silently. Tears just ran down her face while she sat rigid in her chair, hardly daring to move. Mark said, "This is private." I laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. "Private? You dragged your mistress's pregnancy, company accounts, and your wife's mind into this. Nothing about it is private anymore." He stepped forward to close the binder, but Noah stood before he could, putting his body directly between his father and me. I will never forget my son's voice in that moment. Not loud, not shaking, just cold enough that any father with a conscience left should have felt himself split in half. "Don't touch her," Mark stopped short. And in that exact moment, when the sturdy father image he had protected for years cracked open in front of his son, I knew his control was dead. I didn't yell. I didn't rant. I simply named what he had done. "You didn't just sleep with your coworker. You didn't just get her pregnant. You didn't just lie." I looked straight at him, my voice growing calmer and calmer. "You tried to make me doubt my own memory. You used my exhaustion, my sacrifice, the body that gave birth to your children, the gap in my career, everything I poured into this family, to prove that I was the one who pushed you into someone else's bed. You didn't just betray me. You tried to erase my reality." Then I said the sentence Diane later told me sounded like a knife laid down cleanly on a table. "You didn't just cheat. You tried to erase me." No one in that room breathed loudly after that. It was the thick kind of silence that only happens when the truth has come all the way up and is too clear for any decent person to pretend not to see it. Mark opened his mouth several times. At last, he said exactly the thing I had been expecting, because men like him always have only one song at the end. "This family had problems long before Jessica." "Of course," I answered. "Every family does. Not every man weaponizes them." He turned toward his parents, toward our children, toward the room, trying to find one soft pair of eyes that still had space for him. There weren't any. Even my mother-in-law, who had defended her son through every small domestic friction of the years, was looking at him as though she no longer knew what she had given birth to. My sister sat very straight, gripping her glass until her knuckles went white. And then Emma finally spoke, the first sentence she had said all evening, and it landed exactly where I knew it would hurt most. "So every time you said Mom was overreacting, you already knew she was right?" Mark couldn't answer. To me, that was bigger than any legal judgment ever could have been. Jessica wasn't there that night, but her absence was everywhere in the room. I had printed the emails proving she knew Mark was married, the screenshots of her liking old family posts, the line she had texted him. "I know you'll never really leave until someone forces the story open." When my mother-in-law read that, she sat down so slowly I thought she might collapse. "She knew," she whispered, almost to herself. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was doing its work too well on its own. Mark finally could no longer deny it. That is the strange thing about a carefully prepared exposure. In the end, people stop lying not because they suddenly become honest, but because they know every lie now has to pass through a stack of paper. They don't confess. They just shrink. They get smaller. They reveal themselves without effects, without flattering light, without an audience being managed. That night, Mark lost more than a wife. He lost the ability to tell the first version of the story. And for people who live by control, that is the real fall. In the weeks that followed, his image collapsed not in the way it does when someone posts a public takedown online and strangers rush in with comments. It collapsed in the heavy, quiet way real life collapses. My father-in-law didn't call him for a month. My mother-in-law sent exactly one text. "I raised you better than this, and maybe that's the cruelest thing you've done to me." Noah brought all his summer things back to my place, instead of going to his father's rented condo. Emma refused to have dinner alone with her father for more than 2 months. At work, the scandal never burst into public view because legal kept a tight lid on it, but the people close enough all knew. Ethan resigned. Jessica went on maternity leave earlier than expected because of a stressful work environment, and everyone understood what that meant. Mark was not fired immediately, but he was moved out of client-facing operations, lost his bonus, lost his team, lost the right to walk into a conference room as a man people admired. The same people who used to shake his hand at fundraisers now only gave him a flat nod if they happened to pass him at Whole Foods. In suburban American life, there are punishments that do not require a judge to declare them. They reveal themselves in who still gets invited to summer barbecues, who is still trusted to chair the PTO fundraiser, who remains the person neighbors ask to hold a spare key when they go away. Mark lost those things slowly and absolutely. I saw it, and I won't lie and say I felt nothing like satisfaction. I did, but it was cold, not bright, not redemptive. It felt like watching a house that had once threatened to collapse on top of me finally come down, only to realize the dust still filled my lungs afterward. We divorced in early winter the following year. Not loudly, not dragged out forever, because by then he no longer had enough psychological power left to turn everything into an endless negotiation. I got primary custody of Emma while she was still a minor. The house was sold, the money divided. I went back to work part-time at a high school, and then gradually increased my hours. First day I walked back down a school hallway with a new staff badge hanging around my neck and a stack of student files in my arms. I nearly cried over one very small thing. My name stood alone on the office door, not tied to being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's household manager. It wasn't a miracle. I still slept badly. I still jumped when a phone lit unexpectedly in the dark. I still had days when I sat in the car outside Emma's school while rain tapped the windows and had to remind myself that no one was trying to bend my memory anymore. But there was one profound difference. I no longer doubted myself deeply enough to betray my own emotion. A sorrow with a name is less poisonous than a sorrow that keeps being called by the wrong one. One time, almost a year and a half later, Mark stood at the end of the driveway of the rental house after dropping Emma off, his hand still resting on the car door, his face looking older by more than the actual number of years. He said, "I know none of this matters now, but I was unhappy too." I looked at the man who had once made me doubt my own mind and understood the coldest thing pain had finally taught me. He could be telling the truth. He could have been unhappy. He could have been lonely. He could have been afraid of aging, afraid of fading, afraid that suburban life with a mortgage, PTA meetings, aging parents, and a son heading to college was swallowing the image of himself he liked best. All of that could be true, and it still changed nothing important. "I know," I said. He looked up. Maybe he hadn't expected me to grant him that. I kept my eyes on him for one more measured beat and said, "But being unhappy didn't make you do this. It just became the excuse you liked best." Mark opened his mouth as if to say more, and then didn't. That was the difference between us by then. I no longer needed him to understand my pain in order for it to count. I no longer needed him to validate the truth for the truth to exist. And when you stop needing that from the person who gaslit you, that is when you truly walk out of their prison. If anyone asks me the worst thing he did to me, I won't say it was getting his mistress pregnant, even though that was the bluntest, deepest slash. The worst thing was that he tried to make me doubt my own reality. He didn't just destroy trust. He tried to destroy the instrument I used to know when trust was being broken. That is the most sophisticated kind of psychological violence. It leaves no bruises. It leaves blanks in your memory. Moments when you are telling a story and stop in the middle to wonder if you remember it correctly. Mornings when you wake up and spend a few panicked seconds sorting through which parts of your mind still belong to you. I survived infidelity. I survived divorce. But the thing I had to learn for the longest was the right to trust my own perception without needing anyone else to certify it. Now, if people look at me from the outside, they might think I'm fine. A clean apartment near the school, a career back on track, a daughter slightly taller than I am, filling out college applications. Noah graduated and now works in Minneapolis. My mother is weaker than she used to be, but still strong enough to call and ask whether I've changed my winter tires yet. I have a few plants in the kitchen, a new couch, a bank account in my own name, and a life that doesn't need anyone's permission to change the color of the sheets. But fine is not the same thing as intact. Some wounds stop bleeding and still alter the way you walk. I can still hear with perfect clarity the sound of sentences like "you're imagining things," "you're too emotional," that never happened the way you think. I still remember standing in that kitchen with the smell of rosemary in the air, listening to the man I married place another woman's unborn child on my back. And I still remember that most humiliating second, the second I believed him. Maybe that is why I will never let anyone, including myself, soften this story into some clean lesson about womanhood, awakening, or rebirth. No, there is rebirth, but it is dirty. There is reclaiming your voice, but the price is hearing it echo in a room full of ashes. If I had to sum up my life in a single sentence, I would not say he destroyed me. He tried, but he did not entirely succeed. The more accurate thing is this: he tried to destroy my reality, and I survived long enough to pull it back to its true name. He didn't just make me lose trust. He tried to make me lose the right to define what had happened to me. And the one thing that finally got me out was not revenge, not justice, not a new man, not a prettier life. It was clarity. The moment I stopped asking, "Did I make him do this?" and started asking, "Why did he need me to believe that?" From that moment on, things did not become easier, but they became real. And sometimes, after you have been gaslit for too long, the truth is not light. It is only the floor, hard, cold, painful under your feet, but in the end still the thing that keeps you from falling any farther. He didn't just break my trust. He tried to break my reality, and I survived both.